There's primary and secondary emotions. And whenever a man says, oh man, I'm feeling angry and frustrated, I said, okay, what else? Dig a little bit deeper, because that's so culturally accepted. A man punching a hole in the wall, a man getting in your face, a road rage, those are culturally accepted. But usually there is another emotion hiding beneath that.
Welcome back to the Glen Gilbert Connection. Today we're joined by Dr. Brian Licuanan, a psychologist with postdoctoral training and certified in cognitive behavioral therapy. Dr. Licuanan is also a martial artist and emotional strategist. We're diving into the silent crisis facing divorced men, the emotional patterns that shape relationships, and how healing begins with clarity, courage, and connection. Dr. Licuanan, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks. Great being here.
So tell us a little bit about your history and interest in psychology before we dive too deep.
A little bit about my history, at least education-wise, PhD, psychology, counseling psychology, as well as a master's in psychology with a clinical emphasis, but also a master's of science in a field called industrial organizational psychology, which a lot of people aren't very aware of. It has nothing to do with therapy, but these are your consultants in the workplace. These are your human resource directors that study behavior in the workplace. They look at culture. They look at finding the right employees for good fit. They design various instruments for employee selection, personnel selection. So just a wide gamut of psychological work that I've been involved with along the way. I worked with adolescents who were severely emotionally abused. That was sort of my first introduction into the psychological realm. And then I worked for almost 15 years in residential treatment for adults struggling with mental health and substance addiction. Currently, I telehealth. I see outpatient clients across California, but also as well is I'm also a psychologist in what we call the crisis unit for the California Department of Corrections at a maximum security prison. So in addition to that, I enjoy doing what we're doing today, spreading mental health awareness through the National Alliance of Mental Illness, through parents of addicted loved ones, but I also enjoy becoming a guest on podcasts, write articles and stuff like that. So I think that's a big part of my mission, is to really spread mental health awareness, destigmatize it, and really enculturate people on the psychological realm and things that they can do to empower themselves.
Nice, beautiful. Just a side note, shout out to month of November, I think it is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes.
Just letting everybody know out there. So outside of your day job as a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, you provide clinical work as a therapist. What was the attraction to Jiu-Jitsu and how does it help you with your business?
Yeah. Well, I did martial arts before. I was fortunate to grow up in a family that was exposed to sports, whether it be soccer, whether it be baseball and so forth throughout college, intramural sports. And I did compete in karate growing up as an adolescent. And then graduate school came, and so the gym was pretty much my level of athleticism, with the occasional touch football on Fridays at graduate school. But, my focus changed. And about 8 years ago, I enrolled my daughter into a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy. And when I was watching her, it really sparked this passion in me and this competitiveness and so forth. I said, man, this is something that I can do. And what actually happened is she decided to compete in a competition. And so that was one of my commitments to her. So just 2 months into my training as a white belt, I entered a tournament. And and ever since then, never looked back. I've competed every single year in the past 8 years. And so it's just one of my passions. And definitely there's a lot of parallels, metaphors of what goes on in the mats and to real life in terms of putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, devising solutions, and recognizing there's a solution for every problem, and to really push that threshold of discomfort. And a lot of times we just sort of metaphorically tap out when things get a little uncomfortable, and which I believe is somewhat of a cultural challenge in our society today. As parents, we don't want our kids to be uncomfortable, and so we sort of, lack of a better word, enable them and prevent them from creating solutions and having failures. And so definitely jiu-jitsu every day is one of the most humbling sports. You could be the most athletic, the strongest guy in the world. I mean, actually have um, world's strongest men, get on the mat with a much smaller person and they get tapped out very quickly. It's because it is a uh, leveler. It's the one thing that you learn something every time, and you can expose a lot of your deficiencies and flaws.
Right.
And it's also a mental game, and that's why you see a lot of people like Zuckerberg of Facebook, and a lot of these other people who are attracted to the mental chess that it requires. Every single role can change and be different. Right. And so that's some of the reasons why I got attracted to it. And it's the best shape I've ever been in as well.
Right. Yeah. I applaud you for getting out into to do competitions a couple months in. I think a couple minutes in for me, I tweaked my finger and I'm like, uh-oh. I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a discipline rooted in control, flow, and resilience. How does this mirror psychological healing, especially for men and women navigating post-divorce identity shifts?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. That's a good parallel. Let me sit with that a little bit. So post-divorce, and working with a lot of clients who go through divorce, for people who've been married for a very long time and maybe that's their only partner, it's just scary. It's like I said, it's very, very uncomfortable. There's a shift in identity, a reconfiguration, and coming up with solutions. And I believe that is very powerful. Like I said before, in jiu-jitsu is you take life. It focusing on the things you can and cannot control, focusing on not only your strengths, but also your deficiencies. And divorce is one of the most challenging emotional, mental, interpersonal issues we can deal with. Is such immense grief and loss. Presumably if that person was someone you were with a long time, they were a big part of your identity. And of course, you add elements like kids. It's a really tough arena. And you mentioned resilience. That is one of the most defining factors confirmed with research. And another word for resilience is grit, that ability to bounce back, essentially. And what I find in the work that I do as a clinician and in jiu-jitsu and any sport, it's talent and skill can only take you so far. Right. And grit, and the people that really push themselves and are the ones who really thrive. And a divorce is a level of grit and resilience. Just take one day at a time, rather than focusing on what you have maybe gained and not what you've lost. And so that would be my initial parallel between divorce and what jiu-jitsu provides.
Right. I understand. But next to a family member dying, divorce is like number 2 as far as psychological impacting.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah. In your view, what does a sound mind, body, and spirit look like for a man re-entering the dating world, say after heartbreak or divorce?
Well, if I may back up a little bit, one of my belief systems is I believe there's 5 major areas of one's life that lend to healthiness, but if we're neglectful in one or more of those, can result in unhealthiness. And so you mentioned a couple of them. Number 1 is our physical self. What do we do with our body? How do we treat our body? What do we put into it? How do we eat? How do we take care of it? Do we exercise? And all those aspects of the physical component are 1/5 of those 5 factors. And you have the mental / emotional part. It's how you think, how you regulate your emotions, or how do you navigate through emotional dysregulation, right? Is dysregulation is I'm distressed. And like I said, how we think, are we a half glass full or half glass empty?
Right.
Are we solution focused? Are we problem focused? Are we looking at the things we can't control, or are we focused on the things we have no control over?
Mhm.
So that's number two. That accounts for 1/5. Three is the social aspect. Social is are the things that are outside of us. These are relationships. These are friendships, romantic relationships, extracurricular activities, family involvement. And I add a fourth one is career. Career because career is almost 50% when we're working our life. If you think about it, at least 1/3 of our life, 8 hours of a day minimum, typically speaking, and career is essential, important. The last component I talk about is spiritual. Right, spiritual is a broad umbrella. Spiritual could mean the belief in a higher power or God, or it could mean a deeper sense of self or purpose in life. And so those five areas are, I believe, essential and critically important for our well-being. And if we're not attending to one or more of those, if all we're focusing on our career, but yet we haven't taken care of our physical self, or we haven't taken care of our emotional self, it's going to catch up to us. And so it's so important. It may shift every once in a while, where one of them has to be prioritized over another. But when we focus on those five areas, at least what I find in the many clients I've seen, those are the five predominant areas that are really important to attend to.
Yeah.
And then, but in terms of a divorce, and can you do me a favor? Can you rephrase your question again, just so I make sure I'm addressing
Yeah.
it correctly?
So well, so we're looking at sound mind, body, and spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And for those men, I do obviously focus on men, and it's those men that are, I feel like I'm a man of integrity. I've made this commitment for life, and now all of that is gone. So what do I need to do, or how, you know, for me getting back out into the dating world, or me recovering from this breakup that I'm just broken from? Um, what should that look like? What should I do? What should I plan on doing going forward? I've always said the first things you should start doing is just, make your bed in the morning. At least
Mm-hmm.
you've accomplished one thing.
Yes.
I think that was from Admiral McCracken.
For the University of, I believe it's UT Texas, that he gave that
Yeah,
commencement speech to.
yeah, exactly. And then I get into other things of like doing things to take care of yourself, eating right, sleeping right, going to the gym. But I don't really talk too much about the psychological impact of,
Mm-hmm.
when you're
Mm-hmm.
walking away from something you thought you were really putting everything into, and then all of that's gone.
Mm-hmm.
What needs to be done, and how do I prepare for what's out there? Because say, if for those guys that are in a relationship or have been in a relationship for 10, 15 plus years, the dating world is completely different nowadays. The
Mm-hmm.
dating apps have changed everything. um, Social apps have changed interactions between people. I think there's less people going out to bars, and I'm talking to guys that maybe don't even know, like they don't feel comfortable going to a club, or going to a club is just like out of the question type of thing. But more of, they're just getting out of this long-term relationship, and what should they start doing for themselves going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, from a psychological realm, to first start off with is you've got to give yourself permission to go through the grief and loss process.
Mm-hmm.
For your listeners out there that aren't so familiar with grief and loss, we tend to think grief and loss is just pertaining to death, right? And so I'm grieving. Well, who passed away? And grief and loss is this sense of a loss of anything that could lead us to having a major transition in our life, usually have a negative impact.
Mm-hmm.
A divorce is one of those, a bankruptcy, a loss of job. You can grieve empty nest syndrome when your kids go to leave the home for whatever reason.
Sure.
You can get to a bad accident and lose a limb. You can have a medical diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, and those are grief and loss. And so just real quickly, the stages of grief and loss are the shock and denial, right? The first stage where, oh my God, I don't believe it, or oh my God, we're getting divorced. You get served those papers, that lump feeling you feel that numbness.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got the anger part. Well, we want to direct anger. We need to find a lightning rod. I'm going to be angry at him or her. I'm getting angry at the parents who influenced it, or I'm going to be mad at the job that causes it, or whatever else.
How dare they? How
Yeah,
dare
how
they?
dare they? And so we
Yeah.
want that anger to, we need a lightning rod to focus on that anger.
Right.
And there's bargaining. Bargaining can be like, hey, if we get back together, I promise to be a better person. Or if you believe in a higher power, if you just help me find someone else, ease the pain of this divorce, then I promise to go to church often, right? And then you get the depression, right? Depression is, of course, a little less motivation to do things, feeling sad. There's a gamut of depression from mild, moderate to severe. And then there's acceptance. Acceptance to me is when you're at peace with that reality. Does that mean you forget? Does that mean you never think about the person or have any emotions during anniversary dates? Absolutely not. But it's to a point where I'm in living acceptance. I'm at a level of acceptance. I'm ready to turn the page. But the reason why there's some research that talks about a stage in between there is because sometimes people think that from depression, you're just going to wake up one day and, okay, I'm being acceptance, I'm ready to date again. And no, I like the one that some research talks about is that upward turn. And it's where I look at depression sometimes, depending on the levels, we're kind of stuck. You have a Jeep of some sort and you're stuck in the mud and you can't get out and exhausted and you're tired. The upward term of those little movements, we're just trying to get out of that hole. And so from there, it's those, like we talked about earlier, it's those little things that you do. Go to the gym again, start returning calls, get back to work a little bit, find a new hobby. It's these micro successes. And then we work towards acceptance. And typically speaking, if I may share, there's two main distinctions. There's the normal grief, where some research talks about that no matter what you're grieving, loss of a child, which is probably one of the most difficult things to grieve, divorce, a bankruptcy, a job, that if you go through all the stages, you give yourself permission to be angry, to cry, to talk about it, to vent, about a year's time is typically speaking where we can reach that acceptance stage. Mm-hmm. There's complex grief where people don't go to those stages. I literally have people who 7 years never talked about the loss of a loved one. I had a gentleman who was divorced for over 20 years. His partner remarried and he still had his wedding picture sitting by his bed. And so that's complex grief. And complex grief can last years, sometimes a lifetime. And so just recognizing, that's what I would, to answer your question, that's what I tell whether divorced men or women is give yourself that allowance to grieve, but don't stay stuck there. Right. And so in addition to other things you're saying, it's those little micro successes. Stagnation is what you want to avoid. Stagnation in life, whether it be physically, mentally, and that's what happens. And sometimes people overcorrect. To avoid stagnation, they overcorrect. Oh, so I'm still going to date now. When I hear people that, oh, I just got a divorce and I'm still dating, or we're separated and still dating. I'm not saying every case is is the same, right. But you're not allowing yourself to grieve. You're just hyper avoiding stagnation. And when you don't do that, obviously you're not that complete person in that new relationships that you enter, and that usually can catch up to itself because there's unresolved issues there. So those would be my main things: is give yourself permission to grieve, be active in the grieving process, but continue to maintain micro successes, especially in those 5 areas of life.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about, kind of going back to the genesis of the question is guys are just broken because everything they thought about down the road, 10 years, 20 years, this is a house I'm going to die in type of thing is now gone. Mm-hmm. And they're in that spot. I think also something hit me is like, when's a good time to start dating after a divorce? It's like, when should it be like, well, this is too soon, or it's been like it's been 20 years since my divorce. Should I go out and start dating now? Like, when would be a good time, would you say, to do it? Or is it this, per person, person specific type of gig?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I could quantify that. And that's just one of those things where you just can't quantify. And I think there has to be a real true honesty with yourself, and that I'm healing, or I'm healed, and I'm heading in a good direction. Right. And so that's what happens a lot is when we're wounded, For example, in this case, we date to sort of cover that wound, and we never really resolve those wounds. And that's where people will get into trouble, is at least in those relationships. And of course, we call the word the rebound, and that's what happens. And so, and then you can get in a deeper emotional abyss when you continue to experience that. And what happens too, it can happen, is you create this level of apathy, right? And what then relationships, and you just don't care. But another thing too that's important is, we usually, when we experience a level of a traumatic experience, we create what we call these core beliefs. And so if someone was divorced because that partner left me, then we have this global representation of relationships are never going to last, or a male, that all men can't be trusted, or all females can't be trusted. And so that's something, part of the grief and loss process, is that we have to move away from creating these very, very solid belief systems. We do that naturally as a coping mechanism, but people don't let that go. And I could tell you how many countless people are stuck there. They correlate the level of hurt, meaning to the level of the globalization of a belief system. You hurt me that much, therefore all things. It's no different than a dog biting you as a kid.
Right.
As you know, they create this protective layer that all dogs are dangerous. And yeah, I think there's a really survival mechanism, because if you get bitten by a dog, last thing you want to do is go to a group of dogs and start petting them. I think there's that. But when you don't process through and break those belief systems, then you can stay stuck and stagnant for a very long time.
Yeah, it does. It sounds a lot. And I started finding myself falling into the similar trap of, like, because of one anecdotal experience, you're going to make a generalization.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, whoa. I got to put brakes on that one, because that's just not sound. And what it almost does is forced me rather to start looking at, well, what was going wrong? What could have I have done better? What could have we have done better? And that, for me, it generated more questions as to, well, if I could have done this better, what was I doing wrong? And so it creates a lot of self-reflection to where you can start possibly improving yourself, because making a generalization is just going to kind of create a disaster.
Yeah. And one of the big things I talk about is, and this is not just divorce, this is, I think, in that's generalizable in all areas of life, is, for example, if you're married and there's obviously two of you, what happens is, like I said, we want a lightning rod for our anger and pain. And usually, unfortunately, it's the other person. And but when you look at, no matter what, who did what, you cheated on me, I cheated on you, I was an alcoholic, you were an alcoholic, or whatever it may be, the healing takes place when I'm saying, no matter what happened, I'm assuming 50% responsibility, no matter what. And I'm going to work on 100% on that 50%. And that's what happens. Well, you know what? He was 90% of the issues because he always worked and he was an alcoholic, and I didn't have anything to do with that. Some of the most dangerous words, I don't know if danger is a heavy word, but too much of a heavy word, but danger in terms of the lasting is of a relationship is whenever someone says, I didn't do anything wrong, it's not my fault. Man, that's part of that disease, is because whenever you have two people in a dynamic, doesn't matter what the issue is, everyone had some level of responsibility, whether it be someone enabled an issue, whether it be someone manipulated the situation. And that's the healthiest way to go. And from there comes self-improvement. And then one thing I want to say to you, I just reminded me, is what happens a lot when people are in relationships, and that's why it's so important to maintain our identity, is a healthy relationship to me is this integration, right? This integration when you can separate, right? What happens when people get into relationships because they're filling voids in the relationship, they become entangled. Another word we call that is enmeshed or codependent. And that's why when people divorce, they lose a whole sense of self, is because their identity has been so wrapped into it. Even if you've been married for 40 years, yes, you are integrated and so forth. But if you're not maintaining a sense of self, that's why it's important for a partner to be able to go and pursue their passions and so forth. And maybe they do it together, right? I told you earlier off camera is that my wife and I both train jiu-jitsu, and she's been training for 3 years now, and that is our Thursday and Sunday gig. And yeah, we're partners and so forth, and it's this maintaining our identity, but this integration that we have as well. And so obviously shared activities are great, but even if they're not shared activities, maintain that level of interdependence is critically important. So that's why you get a lot of couples that don't divorce, because I don't know, I've been with him all my life or her all my life. And so when we're in that realm, we've got to work on more of an integration of into the relationship rather than a enmeshment.
Yeah. I think if you can find someone that you have synergy with, it's very powerful. Very powerful. So what role does family crisis intervention play in helping men and women rebuild after divorce or separation? So are there like key strategies that consistently help families recalibrate?
And are you referring to, let's say, a divorced family where there's kids involved and they're trying to parent again? Or are we talking about, what are you referring to? Are you referring to, hey, they're just going their separate ways and I don't want anything to do with you? What are you referring to, if you don't mind? Sort
of the latter. Maybe they're still amicable, they still have a relationship for the children, but they're separated. It's children custody is divided by 50-50 every 2 weeks, type of switch off. But it's like the family's separated. Well, I think one of the biggest things, the biggest barriers for acceptance, like I mentioned earlier, is our natural tendency is to blame, find fault, and I call it the lightning rod. And the most unhealthy divorce dynamics are those family members who continue to blame the other person, don't look inward at their own fault. And unfortunately, the kids become sort of on one level the pawns, or they become the mediators in that. And that's one of the worst things you can do. Is I tell people all the time, don't talk bad about your partner. There's nothing good. It's poisonous. It's a lot of distress for the kids, and they end up being angry and resentful. It's not uncommon where some kids or teenagers or even adult kids say, I'm done with this. Go your way. I'm not doing this. And so it's going to be very important. That's part of the healing process is, like I said earlier, instead of that blame, there's a saying, when you're doing this a lot, pointing, remember there's three fingers pointing right back at you. Right. There really is. And we do that. She did that. He did that. So you know what? We both had a role in it. We're no longer compatible. And so one thing I also tell people to do if they're officially divorced and really moving that direction, and there's kids involved, focus on your relationship as parents, no longer as this romantic relationship. And that's what happens a lot. It's like, oh my God, this and that, and kind of still love them or not. And you have to decide. If are we going to focus our energies on being the best parents we can be, being amicable and compatible on that level. And it's very hard for people to blend those two. We're separated, we're working on a relationship, but then we're going to be parents. It really confounds the issues. And like I said, the big one is taking self-responsibility, leave the kids out of it. Do not let them be the channel of communication, talking bad, because you're also teaching the kids on how to navigate through adversity, that we don't take responsibility, we blame other people, and trust me, it's a bad place for the kids to be involved, whether they're adolescents, they're kids, or they're even adults. Is keep that between you and them, and don't spew poison about your partner. Yeah, don't use the children. You reminded me of a statement by James Sexton, the famous divorce attorney out of New York, talked about, I think, in one case where I think one of the parents was, and it's just, if you write it out, if you type it out, it looks kind of like somewhat benign, but if it's verbalized, it's like, did he bring you a jacket? Were you cold outside? You probably might have been really cold outside if you were, with him that day. And just the voice and how it was coming across to the child, and how talking to the child, there's a sense of contempt for the other parent. And it's just like what you're saying. It's just how you talk to the child about the other parent should be
Mm-hmm.
not in such a negative,
Mm-hmm.
degrading manner,
Mm-hmm.
because the child will walk away with going, oh, dad or mom might have been really bad because dad or mom is thinking, saying bad things about him or her,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
And you don't want to put the child in a position where they're going to have to choose, right? There's a no-win situation, right? Is they want their parents and they're hurting through this as well. And a lot of times, unfortunately, selfishly, is we need someone to co-sign our pain. And unfortunately, kids can be those people, right? You can have all your friends and they're going to co-sign all they want.
Sure.
And of course that's going to happen, but you want the kids, and of course there's custodial issues involved with a divorce. But if I may say one thing too, I know we're talking about divorce, but sometimes things that we can do before we divorce. And Gottman are researchers that talked about the well, sorry, research on intimacy. Intimacy is closeness. We always think intimacy sometimes is physical sex, and no, it's a form of expression of intimacy. But intimacy just means closeness, and four factors that are important for maintaining an intimate relationship are: number one, dialogue. Are we communicating? Right? Are we talking? Right? It's very hard to be connected with someone if you're not communicating, and then of course, and speaking and so forth. Another one is transparency. Are we being honest? Are we being transparent or vulnerable? Are we willing to put down our guard and be vulnerable to our partner and not feel like there's going to be retribution for that a person's going to use that against me? And there's a reciprocity, right? There's a give and take, they call equity, which is fairness in a relationship. The higher degrees of unfairness in relationship, right? I'm working all the time and you're not doing anything else, or I do all the housework, take care of the kids, and you don't participate in that. That creates a level of inequity that leads to dissatisfaction. So for your listeners out there, right, if you are in with this divorce and so forth, just ask yourself, those the four things. Are we communicating in dialogue? Are we having reciprocity? Are we being transparent and vulnerable, which are critical factors in maintaining intimacy?
Sure. No, it's very important. Wanted to shift a little bit to, again, men coming out of a relationship where they're broken. So I think in today's society, I believe men have become, it's where shaming men has become somewhat normalized, and in ways that make it feel socially permissible. And so looking at those guys that are coming out of a relationship or are still in a broken relationship, how impactful do you think is shame on self-confidence, and what can guys do about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, shame to me is one of the most powerful. There's a couple ones, a lot of emotions that are very powerful, but shame is one of them, and guilt and fear are those three. And you're right. I'm very big on people who use just their words out there flippantly, right, easily. And one of the big things, as that get labeled with men is narcissist. Hey, he wanted to go hang out with his friends. Boom, he's a narcissist. I think this is one of the words that are just used too loosely. Someone just wants to take care of their own needs. Boom, they're a narcissist. And I believe predominantly that's more focused on men. And so whenever I have a client that says, "Oh, he's a narcissist," or "he was abusive," I explore that more, and I will challenge that patient a little bit more. And I think that's just one of those concepts that a lot of men get unfairly labeled onto them. And I mean, a female or whoever, it doesn't have a female, there's any partner, right? It can relate. Let's say, just for example, for this explanation's sake, let's say a female, would like to spend quite money on self-care, or go to the spa and so forth.
Right.
We're not going to all of a sudden label that person as a narcissist, right? Necessarily speaking, but I do believe in many cases that men have been thrown the narcissist label a little bit too loosely, and a lot of that is lack of education, just naivety, right? And I think we've overcorrected again on something of that. If a man just says, you know what, I'm going to do this, this is something I need to take care of, boom, they're a narcissist, right? But we forget about all the other factors that are involved. And so I think as a society, we're very quick to put labels. We went through that with ADHD with kids back in the day. Oh gosh, you can't concentrate, you have ADHD, right? No, sometimes kids were too intelligent. They were bored. And so, yeah. And so
they're just amped up. They're like 10-year-olds got some testosterone going. They're like,
they're just kids, right? They're bored. They're kids. Having a child sit in a classroom for 9 hours or 8 hours of a day, we got to look at those factors. And so, but shame is very big, feeling humiliated and so forth. And it's because sometimes we assign a lot of responsibility on the man when things don't work out right. They can't provide enough. And I think, shaming, and then that's where people taking equal share of responsibility can sort of circumvent shaming, right? Because you shame because you believe you're attributing that person for being mostly at fault. But when you look back at yourself, it's humility. I think humility is one of the most important things. It's humility is just this this sense of being open to vulnerability, that I'm humble enough. And that comes from, if you actually look at the word humility, it comes from the word having been humiliated. Mm-hmm. That's where humility comes from. And so, but I think if you're humble enough to look inward and look at that is one way to prevent the shame process.
Yeah. Nice. I'm just digesting everything you said.
I know it's a lot.
Fantastic. It is a lot. It's a lot. So we're going to shift a little bit again to something a little more serious. According to the CDC, men self-delete around 3 to 4 times higher than women. However, a study published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health found divorced men were over 8 times more likely to die by self-deletion than divorced women. I'm curious as to, why do you think that is? And, what can we do as a society? What could we do better with this information?
Just to clarify for listeners as well, self-deletion referring to someone taking their own life, suicide. So, research consistently showed the statistics between men and women and successful suicides and so forth. And so, on a very gender level, generally speaking, women are typically more likely to engage in what we call parasuicidal behaviors, talking about it, cutting on themselves, but not actual taking their life in that regard. And they're more willing to talk about things that they're struggling with. Men, the reason why they tend to have more successful suicides is because they're, generally speaking, they're less likely to talk about what's going on, and the means to which they do it are violent, shooting themselves, jumping off, crashing a car, and so they're a little more likely to engage in more violent means of self-deletion. And so that statistically, that's to answer somewhat of your question of why is statistically so high. But one thing that's interesting too, just to let you know, since we're on the topic of suicidality, is research also shows, and I've seen this with clients I've worked with, is that, most people don't truly want to die. They just want the pain to stop. And that's what happens is there's one of the great sayings I've ever had is that every storm eventually runs out of rain. Is it can't rain forever, right? The pain, whatever else, and sometimes we feel like it's never going to go away. Even the loss of a loved one, every storm eventually it will run out of rain, and so. So I think it's really important for men, and I do believe, at least in America, we're seeing a cultural shift that we are destigmatizing. Men are being more open to talk about how they're feeling, and it's okay to talk about that I feel a certain way. And that alone, when you connect with someone right? That hormone called oxytocin, that feeling of connection makes you feel better. And that's one of the reasons why people, when they talk to a friend or go to therapy, that accounts for why people feel better, because there's a release of oxytocin. It gets released when you're intimate with someone, you hold hands with someone, you hang out with friends. That level of the feel good hormone is released. And so, but yeah, and but suicide is very real, and we don't take it lightly. You know, if someone keeps talking about suicide or threatening it, obviously that's not normal. Sometimes, well, you're really manipulating. If you really want to kill yourself, you would have done it. But so that's that. And then the other thing I wanted to say is many people who attempted suicide and survive had reported changing their mind at the last minute,
Yes.
at the last second. Sorry, not even last minute, last second.
Yes.
And many people, it's sad to know that how many people actually change their mind after jumping off a bridge or regretting after they shot themselves or taking a copious amount of pills, actually had a change of heart and unfortunately didn't make it. So
Yeah.
so just know, and just asking someone, how are you doing, can actually save a life. You don't think it can, right? If you see someone who's down and out, just saying, hey, man, thinking about you. A text to saying, hey, you'd be amazed of how much that can actually get someone out of that window of wanting to end their life.
I think several thoughts are coming to my head as far as I've listened to other clinicians talk about suicidal behavior. His name's Dr. K. I think he's an MD, psychiatrist, and he talks about how his clients that have been successful with suicide do not show any kind of symptoms, do not show anything as far as like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. They just almost seem in a state of calmness. And then you also reminded me of, I follow Ryan Terabon, and he was looking at the people that were committing suicide off of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I don't know the numbers of people that were successful, but some people have survived. And to confirm what you're saying, he said something very, very similar as to apparently as they're falling, they wish they didn't do it. And then they're able to come back and talk about it afterwards. It was a mistake.
And on that level too, is because they've, interviewed people who have jumped over off bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge, and then they did survive.
Yeah.
Is that they said that had someone just asked me, are you okay? Do you need help? That would have changed their mind. Right. And that would have been enough for them to reconsider. And what you mentioned earlier, that there's some people who are very quiet about it because, mental health, it looks different, right? You can have someone who's smiling and laughing, going to work, very successful, and then they end up killing themselves. I believe, at least for me, and this is just my own anecdotal, I believe those type of people are what we call outliers. Those people where they present a certain way, you'd never guess, like, God darn it. It's like, wow, that came out of nowhere. I think those are on the bell-shaped curve. Those are outliers. Most people who end up taking their life, they fall in that medium range where it's a perfect storm, right? They're going through a divorce, a bankruptcy, they're having arguments, the depression, they're deteriorating, their activities of daily living, of showering and eating have gone. They're no longer participating in activities that they engaged in. Their substance abuse has increased. Those were most of the people fall in that category, because sometimes people think like, well, gosh, they've been planning that for months and years. Yeah, there's some people that do that. But I believe the outliers of people who actually commit suicide is this small window where it's a perfect storm. And the reality is you can get out of that window very quickly by just engaging and talking with someone or someone reaching out to them. I had a client before who literally had a gun in his car, very successful man, but going through a divorce. And they were going through custodial issues. And he pulled over on the side of the road and called 911. He said, I have a gun beside me. I want to kill myself. And the dispatcher had traced his locations. California Highway Patrol came, took him to the hospital. He was actually discharged from the hospital that day.
Wow.
Is because it was that brief moment and he was no longer in that place anymore. And of course, they took his gun from him and so forth. But still, that window, we think suicide is this long, drawn-out process. For some people, it can, but most people, They just need some level of hope that there's something worth living for, and just reaching out to someone saying, I care about you, you matter, you're of value, can literally save a life.
Right. Right. It reminds me of, well, I have a couple questions leading into my next question, but it has to do with family members, or even just loved ones of someone who might be struggling emotionally or psychologically. And, I'm thinking specifically of a family member who might be constantly threatening suicide, or they've made several attempts at suicide. I guess coming from, I think you labeled it as a point of desperation as a family member or loved one. How are they to help this other person that's struggling emotionally or psychologically?
Yeah. I can, again, back up a little bit to kind of preface how I'm going to approach this.
Yeah.
Is, I talk about, you're referencing the book I had written, and I talk about the disease, right? There's no unifying definition of disease, right? The World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, Webster's Dictionary, all have these varying definitions of a disease. Of course, we have a medical disease, right? Diabetes, you have a psychiatric disease like depression. But to me, the way I define disease is any entity that causes problems in your life and typically is chronic. And that, with that said, we all have some version of a disease, right? And it doesn't have to be in the DSM or the American Medical Association book, but it could be anything. It could be greed. If that's something that's been chronic in your life and caused problems, that's your version of disease. And so we're all in some form of recovery as well. But I do talk about this disease as a separate entity, in the world of Alcoholics Anonymous and so forth, in the rooms in that level. People talk about it, disease always in the corner doing push-ups, right? Your alcoholism really never truly goes away, so to speak. We've learned to manage it and respect its capabilities, but it's always somewhere in the corner doing push-ups. And that's no different than if your diabetes or A1C level normalizes, or your blood pressure normalizes after having hypertension. It's always going to be a prospect in the corner if you allow it to. And so, but when I talk about the disease, there's this I refer to as this separate entity, like this living entity, because when we can understand something's behaviors and frame of thinking, we can devise a plan for it. So I also talk about this, what I call why people struggle. 80% of why someone struggles when it's their disease is valid, right? They may have had troubled upbringing, abuse, they had, come from low socioeconomic status, if that pertains, or they have a congenital disease. But I also talk about this, what I call this 20%. There's an 80-20% model. 80% are valid reasons. 20% is what I call the manipulation part of the disease. That's part of the disease that creates this barrier. And there's thousands of ways we manipulate. And so, like, that's, sometimes people think that, okay, someone with suicide, oh my God, they're threatening it. It's not really real. That's not part of the disease, and that disease could be a cry for help. It could be trying to get their needs met or their way of seeking validation. And so for suicidality, that's not normal behavior, so to speak. It's not healthy behavior, if anything. Even if someone's threatening it, even if they're using it to manipulate, you don't give me my car, I'm going to kill myself. That's not normal behavior, and our job is to help them obviously change that behavior. Whenever someone says something like that, they're using suicide as some form of manipulation. One way you could say it is, hey, you sound like you're in a really tough spot. I want to be here for you. I can't help you in the way you need. How can I best help you? Let's get you the help that you need. And so you're validating the person, but you're also not falling down that rabbit hole.
Right.
Of okay, I'll get whatever you want. Okay, gosh, you want that car? You want $100? Here's $100. Right. And so you're actually, what I call assertive love, is that you're coming from a place of love, but setting firm boundaries as well. So when you have a family member that's threatening that, one of the best things you can say to them, hey, you sound like you're in a really tough place. I'm concerned about you, right? What can I do? But if I can't help you, what is the things that we can do? Mm-hmm. And if they're manipulating, then, oh, no, never mind, there's nothing. Or if they really need help, a lot of it can be a cry for help, right. And so So anyway, I hope that answers your question. And I kind of
Yes.
prefaced it and all this, throw in some other things, but suicidality is very real.
Right.
Parasuicidal behaviors are behaviors that a person doesn't necessarily want to die, like cutting themselves or driving recklessly without a seatbelt, but those can lead to suicide eventually. And you can die accidentally engaging in parasuicidal behaviors. You cut yourself a little bit too deep and you bleed out. That
Mm.
that's a that you can die. And so that's not healthy behavior either. And so, but my point is take suicidality, the whole spectrum from actually committing suicide to talking about it and all in between, we take it seriously.
It's kind of what you suggested about shame. It's like it's a good idea to have boundaries and not be
Yeah.
taking advantage of those boundaries, or not letting those boundaries be taken advantage of.
hmm Yeah, yeah. And then one more thing, real thing before boundaries, because a lot of what I like to do is clarify with things, is because a lot of times people think boundaries is this really aggressive, in your face thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that is called for, but that is 1% of the time. Boundaries just means I'm communicating my stance of what I'm going to participate, not participate in, right? That's mainly what boundaries are. Like I said, when someone says I got to have boundaries, that means I got to get in your face and yell at you. No, it's just saying that some of the people that I've met that have set firm boundaries have been smaller in stature, but it's their energy that project, so just know that setting a boundary is just clearly communicating what I'm okay with and what I'm not okay with, and what I'm willing to participate, not participate in.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. For those of you watching or listening right now, and this is hitting home, share it. Subscribe for more real talk. One honest conversation can change everything. Let's continue. Again, shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to get your thoughts on a quote I found from Carl Jung. A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them.
Mm. hmm Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when he describes, obviously, a very, very heavily visual word of inferno of their passions, is that that's what exactly a passion is. It's something that um, that you would try to achieve at all costs, and so if a passion, to me, if it's too easy for you, um, then there's limitations in true growth and change. If you're willing to sacrifice, go through discomfort, willing to fail, but still get up, that's a true passion. People that say, "Oh, well, it didn't work. I tried this sport, I loved it, and I didn't win. I wasn't successful." Then that's not your passion, right? Passion isn't about the win, isn't about the gold medal. It's not about the ranking. It's about the something that drives me. It's that inner fuel, that inner drive, fail or not fail. That's what a passion is. Some people, they love to engage in something, whether it be art in something. They love to do it just because you're not as successful or you're not recognized. Like, how many people are out there singing, right? And don't sell, a million records and so forth, or they're not this Taylor Swift or these very high level people, but they still sing anyway. Right. And that's a passion. And to me, that's what he means, that if you're not willing to fall and get back up, then it's not really a passion. It's a hobby. At least that's how I look at it. Right. For me, right. I've lost many, many times in jiu-jitsu. Humbly, I've won as well. But today I trained earlier, and I didn't have the best time of training. I had a very tough partner, but it's a passion. I'll come back. Going back tomorrow. Right. And a lot of times, when things don't go our way, we bail and we tap out, and that's not a passion. And so, but I do believe we all have some form of passion if we look for it. So keep throwing darts at the board. Sooner or later, something's going to stick.
I call it a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm thinking specifically for men that might be broken from a relationship or something. Find a purpose.
Exactly.
Or in other words, find a passion. And so if you do get knocked down again, you're going to be like, no, I like this so much that I'm going to get back up and keep going after it. Yeah.
And that's why I referred to earlier as the spirituality component, that purpose. That is a major protective factor to depression. People who are chronically depressed, they don't feel like they have a purpose or a passion. I'm not good enough. There's nothing I can do. I'm not. And so that's what I always tell people that struggle with chronic depression is you got to find a purpose, because with purpose comes passion, comes resilience, come successes eventually.
That's perfect. In your work, how do you help people confront and not suppress their emotional chaos? In other words, how do you help people distinguish between emotional suppression and emotional regulation, especially in cultures or generations where vulnerability is seen as a weakness?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, my first thought with this is I look at emotional regulation is like this, being able to turn down that knob, right? We talk about jiu-jitsu is if you go out there screaming your head off and jumping up and down, I'm going to choke you out. Yeah, you're probably going to get beaten pretty quickly, because number one, all your energy is going to that screaming.
Is that what my problem was? Is that what I did wrong?
You're jumping up and down and banging your head on the wall. Yeah, it's probably. That's why you see, if you look at any athlete, whether it be a football, well, take that away, because football, at least, prior to it, but when they're getting ready, when they're lining up in that huddle, or they're lining up on that line, whether it be a baseball player and a pitch, a diver getting ready to swim, or a boxer even, they're calm and collected. They're regulating their emotion, right? And so for me, the difference between emotional regulation is being able to have the skill set to turn that knob down. Suppression is we're stuffing it down and we're never revisiting it. And so you need an outlet, right? Does that mean you got to tell every single person about your emotions and wear it on your sleeves? Absolutely not. Right. But number one, you have to have an outlet, and that could be in the form of a therapy, a trusted friend, a partner. But again, speaking of partners, no one should be your emotional sponge, right? Sometimes people rely on their best friend, my spouse, my parent, and that's a lot for them to take on, especially when they feel they can't help you. But the help of a professional, a coach of some sort, a pastor of some sort, is suppression is the opposite of giving yourself permission. So we have to be able to give ourselves permission so we don't suppress. But emotional regulation, like I said, is that ability, that skill set to be able to adjust the emotions when needed. So emotional regulation is one of the biggest things, most important things. You look at any real high level executive or coach is their emotions are in check. Right. Because when your emotions are in check, you react. And when you react, you don't make the best decisions.
Right. No, I agree 100%. How might this idea of passing through the inferno apply differently to men and women rebuilding after heartbreak or trauma?
Difference between men and women. Well,
how would it apply differently, for a man, and how would it apply differently to a woman?
Well, if I'm answering your question in terms of how you're phrasing it, I talked about earlier those general gender differences. Females are less likely to suppress their emotions, right? Women tend to connect through dialogue, and men tend to connect intimacy through shared activities. You get a bunch of guys watching a football game or a UFC fight, they can not have to say a word. There's this one video on YouTube where there was someone from Europe. They were watching a soccer game, but no one was allowed to make a noise. No one was allowed to cheer or talk. They couldn't. They had to just watch. Even when they scored a goal, they weren't allowed to make any sound.
Oh, wow.
But they were connecting. You could tell they were just connecting with no dialogue. And so generally speaking, and so regarding that, women, they tend to be more open and engage in talking and less suppression. So that would be my kind of the how that plays out differently. And so, but like I said, at least for America, we are starting to see a lot more destigmatization. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I work with as a psychologist in the crisis unit of a maximum security prison. And you get a lot of these prisoners who, unfortunately did some heinous things, talking about, man, I need to talk to my therapist more. I need to talk about my feelings more. And it's a big part of their getting better and resetting and hopefully being re-released, is that there's this destigmatization that it's okay. Whenever I see a big athlete cry, right? That's strength. Daniel Cormier, who is one of the best UFC fighters, Hall of Famer in the UFC. I mean, he would cry a lot. He would cry after a win, a loss, and that's healing, man. To me, that's more impressive than someone that's going to be stoic,
Right.
right? But it's not.
Yeah, I think Mike Tyson was doing that too after every
Mike
fight.
Tyson? Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Mike Tyson definitely made a change, and the way he thinks and so forth. And so, um, but but yeah, I mean that takes a lot more strength to be able to be comfortable in your skin enough to do that.
Yeah.
Being stoic has its place to some degree, but if you're not allowing yourself to decompress, and you unfortunately get that in a lot of professions that don't give you permission, whether it be law enforcement, and if you're not decompressing that, if you're not, it's gonna manifest itself in other ways, anger, resentment, hopefully not on the job, and relationships and marriages. And so you have to have that outlet to be able to release that.
Yeah. I love the sports analogy. And I'm just picturing a couple guys watching the soccer match. They're not saying anything, but they keep looking at each other like, that kind of thing. And about athletes crying, I'm in the Seattle area, and as everybody knows, the Mariners just lost their chance to get to the World Series, right? And Cal Raleigh, I think he was a home run leader this year in Major League Baseball, 65 total for the year. You could tell he was just, after their loss to the Blue Jays, it was just, you could tell he's been crying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and when you get to that point, it's a great thing to also to teach your kids as parents, is that it's okay to cry. It's how you recover from it, right? It's okay to, and that's what happens is, whether it be we're coming from a good place. And one of my other sayings is, just because you're coming from a loving place doesn't always mean it's the right or the best place.
Mm-hmm.
And so allowing your kids to identify emotions and give them it's okay to be sad,
Mm-hmm.
right? One of the worst things I believe you could tell someone is, stop crying. Why are you crying? I'll give you something to cry about.
Walk it off, bro.
Yeah, walk it off, bro. And just say wow, that you sound really hurt from that. What can we do to change it? What are we going to do different about it? How are you going to be better because of it? And so you've got to give that arena for anybody to be able to express it. We won't have emotions if they weren't part of our human condition. They are an important part. It's our gauge, but it's not our only gauge. It's one form of information and data.
Right. I think the way you described emotional suppression versus emotional regulation is really important for guys too. I think that was a really good point. Do you think modern therapy sometimes over focuses on regulation and under emphasizes the value of emotional intensity?
Emotional intensity, focusing more on emotional regulation and not so much emotional intensity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am not quite sure if you can define for me, in your words, what you mean by emotional intensity.
And the question comes from maybe, let me repeat it. Sometimes over focuses on regulation and under emphasizes the value of emotional intensity. So I'm thinking of men who feel so overwhelmed, but just don't feel comfortable expressing how overwhelming they feel to somebody, versus over focuses on regulation, where I think you kind of pointed on it. It's like, just walk it off, just rub some dirt on it, just don't let it bother you, type of thing.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Thanks for clarifying that. And I think just if I was to just look at, generally speaking, is because when you have emotional intensity, that means you are losing control, right? And what is it culturally? A man's supposed to have control. You're supposed to have control. Is there appropriate times and not appropriate times? Like for me, or like for can a firefighter, can it mean the matter of saving a life if they don't bawl in tears and stay task focused? Absolutely. Someone in the military, a police officer, a fighter going into a ring, and so in a role that I do as a psychologist, there's sometimes, so sometimes there's certain roles and appropriateness. But yeah, I think what it is that stigmatization or shame that when we experience emotion, right, especially the more intense means the more weak correlates to the weaker we are. Right? There's a direct correlation. The more emotional intensity there is, the more weak we are, and that's not true. You can invent and just let you know too, since we're talking about men, there's the five universal emotions. I don't know if you're familiar. It's happy, sad, mad, glad, and disgust. Right? Happy, mad, sad, glad, and disgust. No matter where you're in the world, they can relate to it. Other emotions that anyone can relate to, embarrassment, yeah, absolutely. But at least one research talked about those are universal emotions. And men tend to, whenever someone there's primary and secondary emotions, and whenever a man says, "Oh man, I'm feeling angry and frustrated," I said, "Okay, what else?" Dig a little bit deeper because that's so culturally accepted. A man punching a hole in the wall, a man getting in your face, a road rage, those are culturally accepted. But usually there is another emotion hiding beneath that. I feel scared. I feel vulnerable. I feel lost. I feel left out. I feel incompetent. And that's where the real healing takes place. And I'm not saying anger and frustration are invalid. They are very valid. But there's a deeper layer to that where I think a lot of healing can really take place and authenticity can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Shifting gears again. The Stanford prison experiment revealed how quickly people conform to roles under pressure. How do you see this dynamic play out in relationships, especially when men feel they must perform for women as protectors or providers?
Okay. Do you want to briefly, for your listeners, just real briefly, I can do it as well, so they know what the Stanford experiment was?
The way I understood it was, I think students enrolled in this experiment, and some were given the role as a guard, and some were given the role as a prisoner. And what happened was, from my understanding, extraordinary as the guards became overly aggressive and the prisoners became, I don't want to say submissive, but it was like, okay, how else do I put it? They knew they were incarcerated, if you will.
Yeah. So exactly, yeah. Just to clarify, so 24 college students. Most research that you find out there are college students, and that's where sometimes generalizability can be tough. But yeah, so this experiment back then, probably before they had a lot of ethics and rules, Stanford experiment was 24, I believe, male students were what we call randomly assigned, that they were into these groups. You either became a prison guard or you became a incarcerated person. And so they had the uniforms and everything, and they actually had to end the experiment after, I believe, almost 6 days, is because the emotional toll it took. And so when those people, right, just put on those prison guard uniforms, is they became acting out that role, is they became very abusive, very just very authoritarian and so forth. And then the prisoners felt helpless and hopeless, and it became so emotionally damaging they had to end it. And so, yeah, so that's a little bit of a brief limit of that experiment. And so to your question is, can you do me a favor? Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So that experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, it revealed how quickly people conform to roles under pressure. So how do we see this dynamic play out in relationships, especially when men feel they must perform for women as protectors or providers? Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And if, like I said, I always look for positives, and we are seeing a shift generationally, again, in America, because that's what I could speak to more intelligibly about. But we're seeing a shift in gender roles. We're seeing a lot more men become domesticated, stay-at-home dads, right? You see women delaying marriages and having kids to pursue education, be more independent. Because I think on some levels, unfortunately, those women that you see, and I still see to this day, is where they commit their life to being a homemaker and a parent, and then the marriage doesn't last, and here they are without an education, and they're on their own, they're struggling to get on their own feet. But you're seeing in certain professions, right? You're seeing a lot more male nurses in the nursing field. It used to be obviously a predominantly female field, and so you're seeing, of course, women being in high-level positions, CEOs and government high government positions. So, but still, I do think there's are still those roles that people play, and I do think there's still that male part of it where we're supposed to present a certain way. And like I said, you're right. It when talking about mental health wise, we suppress, and that can lead to depression and suicidality because they feel like a failure. They're shamed. They feel like they're not good enough. They feel like that they are pigeonholed into these roles, and if they don't achieve it, then they lose a sense of purpose and meaning. And so, but yeah, I think that's something we have to really recognize is that roles are fluid. They can change. My role right now as a parent can change 5 years from now. It's different than it was 10 years from now, maybe be different 15 years from now. But I think, but identifying roles and know how we can collaborate and is going to be really important. You're seeing a lot more men share effeminate attributes, right? More feminine attributes and so forth. And so I think in terms of roles, I think we are moving in a positive direction with that. And but yeah, so be mindful of the roles, and the more rigidity there is, I think the less likely we're going to be flexible to changing those roles.
Right, right. Real quick, this is kind of a silly question, but imagine a future diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, or a future DSM entry called relational legacy disorder, a condition where unresolved emotional patterns are passed down generationally. What symptoms would you expect, and how would you treat it?
Yeah, no. Well, there's true is generational, right? There's generational trauma, there's generational depression, there's definitely generational suicide. I'm sorry, well, it can be as well, but substance addiction.
Right.
But relationship legacy and what kind of the symptoms? Well, depending on for what angle are we looking at? Are we looking at a more as a dysfunctional legacy or a more functional, productive legacy? I think there's needs some clarification there. What angle were you looking at?
Well, I put down unresolved emotional patterns and how
Unresolved emotional patterns. Okay,
how
sorry.
those are passed down generationally.
Yeah, and so the way it can look like is suppression. You have these certain attributes of like what defines weakness and strength, like, hey, machoism, pull your pants up, get through it. And we, a lot of times there's this comparison. Well, when I was your age, we didn't have this, or when I was your age, we just got through it. And you really create this moat between generations, and we see that a lot. And there's no generation different than others. I hear generations, well, your generation is a lot different than ours, or a lot worse than ours. No, my generation when I was a kid probably was a nightmare to the generation prior. And so when we sort of have this elitist that my generation was better than yours, things may have changed to some degree, but they all have their issues that they to navigate through. But yeah, emotional, it would be, I think, very certain roles and how to behave, right? Like I said, don't talk about their emotions. It's a sign of weakness, what roles people play in. That would be my idea. And I think, like I said, conversations, revising those roles and teaching. It's okay to teach people to be resilient and strong, but it's also okay for people to tap into, hey, it's okay to be vulnerable, to lose, to struggle as well. And to me, it's not so much the struggle, it's how you get out of the struggle.
Yes,
is
of course.
The great learning lesson that you can teach kids.
Right. Absolutely. 100%. So let's talk a little bit about your book, How to Get Your Resisting Loved One into Treatment.
Okay.
So what was the genesis of the book, and how are you defining, tough love and enabling?
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that up. So,
Yeah.
so my book, the way it happened was is one thing that I also like to do is I like to give talks, right, to the National Alliance of Mental Illness for over 15 years. I've been helping support groups. I give talks here and there, and of course in my clinical practice. And what I had found is that there were some very, very consistent patterns of struggles with families who have loved ones who are struggling with mental health or addiction. And it was very formulaic. I would give a talk, and it was the same questions that these families would ask, and it was my same responses to some degree. And I was always asking myself, is there not something out there, like a guide, or anything out there, which I thought there were? And
Right.
so I'd ask clients, the family members, I'd say, is there anything that you know of that a strategy guide to help you guys navigate through this? And they said, yeah, there's some books that talk about something specific. Someone with schizophrenia, how do you deal with someone with alcoholism? But there wasn't really a comprehensive guide of what families can do. And so I finally realized that, wow, there's a little bit of a gap here in this knowledge. And so I was thinking about it for quite a few years, and it was the advent of the pandemic where I was getting canceled appointments, and I said, this is the time. And so I just started typing it out. And again, it was formulaic. I was just typing out the topics that would come up so consistently across the board. And then I was just typing, typing, typing. Of course, it cleaned up over time. But it was what I believe is the answer to a lot of the missing questions and knowledges out there. And so the biggest chunk of my book is what I call the 25 must knows. These are the 25 essential knowledge I think any family knows, whether you're an educator yourself, you're brand new to mental health, you've been navigating through mental health for a long time. It's what I believe are the very thematic struggles out there, right? For example, if I may share, one of them is whenever I ask people struggling with substance addiction or family members who have a loved one struggling with mental health or substance addiction or unhealthy coping mechanisms, I ask them, give me 3 words on why you use marijuana or cocaine, or why does your loved one continue to use painkillers? I say, because it works. They never get it. They say, oh, well, to escape pain, or they'll give me all these 3-word variations, or to be heard. Those aren't wrong, but more simple than that, because it works for what it was originally intended, right? You drink a little alcohol to take the edge off before a work meeting. Yeah, you're going to keep doing it. What happens is the more you need of it, the more counterproductive, as you know, it becomes.
Right.
But because it works. And so that is one knowledge that, and when I tell people, they're like, oh yeah, it works. Because when you fight with people on why not to do it, but you validate them and says, yeah, it works really good. Let's sign for some other things, because we know, drinking alcohol every day probably isn't the most efficient and effective ways to deal with that. And there's other ways to do it. But when you validate them, rather than always arguing, hey, stop drinking alcohol, it's going to be bad for your liver. The natural human condition is to resist that. See, I get it. It freaking works, dude. But how is it working for you now?
Right.
I got 5 DUIs.
Yeah,
5 DUIs. My wife divorced me. They're not working too well.
Right.
But so that's where the genesis of the book came. It's what I believe is a solution guide, a strategy of re-empowering the family to get their loved one to a place where they hopefully accept some help.
Yeah. Yeah. You remind me you can't just tell someone, just don't do it anymore. It just doesn't work. I'm reminded of this movie. It has Joe Pesci and Rodney Dangerfield. I'm totally dating myself. It's from the 80s. Rodney Dangerfield is supposed to, cut out all of his bad habits so he gets this large inheritance. And Joe Pesci's his buddy. And he's like, yeah, man, you just quit smoking. He had like a cigarette. He's, yeah, it's easy. You just quit it. And he puts it out. See, no problem. And then he immediately lights up and has another one.
Yeah.
That's you can't just tell someone to quit, because that's not giving them the full answer. It's not helpful at all.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the disease vaccine and why that is a success for long-term recovery.
Yeah. So the disease vaccine, right, is the sort of the somewhat the cure or the way to manage the disease. And so I found very consistently, I've seen probably hundreds, if not thousands, of family dynamics or clients over the almost 20 years that I've been working. And, certain attributes come up that differentiates people who progress in life in their recovery or treatment and people who don't. right? Simple factors. And so the three factors that that constitute the disease vaccine that I can nearly guarantee you'll be able to manage your disease when it comes to mental health are these three factors. And I use H2O, water, as the we know water is essential for life, but H2O, two H's and an O. The first one is honesty, right? You got to be honest with yourself and others. If you're not honesty, you harbor secrets. You harbor secrets; those turn into resentments, and resentments are unresolved anger that almost always points back at yourself, no matter what's happened. And humility, that I'll talk about later. Humility is respecting what I'm up against, right? For me, again, as a jiu-jitsu competitor, if I disrespect the capabilities of the person, oh man, that guy kind of looks old. He doesn't look like he really works out in the gym. As you know, in jiu-jitsu, that your day can end very quickly. You can fall asleep very quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. And so that's one of the craziest things, and that's why I love jiu-jitsu, is that you see these young teenagers, these underdeveloped or skinny is another word, teenagers who are tapping out full-grown adults.
Right.
And it's because of the leverage and technique, especially when you see females being able to sort of manhandle an adult person or male. It's such reassuring, right? And so being humble, respect the capabilities of your disease, right? You disrespect hypertension, right? Oh man, I'm just gonna just eat and whatever else, and you know what can happen there. And then open to direction is O. Open to direction, being humble enough to be open to direction and feedback. Those three qualities are the most consistent, that when people are successful, in this case, sobriety, recovery, and people who don't, they have or are deficient in those factors.
Right. No, that's awesome. That's great. So final question. If you could sit down with Carl Jung and ask him one question about modern masculinity and emotional healing, what would it be and why? Not to put you on the spot.
What is his take? What I would say, Carl, Dr. Jung, how would you define toxic masculinity? Right? Is it are men getting a fair shot? Right? Is there a misrepresentation of a belief system that creates, like I said, right? Toxic masculinity. And I don't know this. Has there ever been a term toxic femininity?
I think that's coming up now too.
It's coming.
I've heard, so like this question is kind of like, what would you ask about modern masculinity? But I've also heard like toxic masculinity coincides with not historical, but like historical masculinity. All of these types of, putting anything masculine is just a negative. It seems to be in like today's society, right? And I would think it'd be really interesting on his take on that and how he would define it. And because it is I think kind of a topic that's kind of becoming more and more spread. It's like, well, what does it mean to be masculine, and are we defining masculinity as just toxic, or are we looking at other aspects of masculinity that are actually beneficial for us?
And that would be my second question to that is that where do you see, Dr. Jung, where masculinity, where role does it play today? And you're right, exactly right. I believe there's an overcorrection, is that if you're masculine, therefore you must be on some level toxic, or you're narcissistic, or same level for like a female. If you're a certain thing, therefore you must be this. And so I believe generationally we've done overcorrections. You being a pharmacist, look what happened with the whole opiates, right? Now you get true people. I've seen people in their 70s and 80s who are truly in pain, and they are not being able to they're discontinuing their opiate medication. It's an overcorrection because unfortunately some people became dependent on it, and there we go. So there's an overcorrection there. And so I believe that's what we're seeing right now is an overcorrection, right? From females being sort of, and very much so, misrepresentative or marginalized and so forth, but there's an overcorrection, right? And we see that in every arena. And so, Carl, Dr. Jung, where would you see the overcorrection is, and how do we get back to a more balance? Because we are seeing a lot more females having more masculine traits, more masculine having more effeminate traits. So where do you see it going from 20 years from now, Dr. Jung?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So Dr. Licuanan, where can people find you?
Yeah, well, you can, I have a website. I don't know if you're going to put it down in the notes, but drbrianlicuanan.com. That's all lowercase, DRBRIAN as in Nancy, LIC as in cat, UAN as in Nancy, AN as in Nancy.com. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Licuanan as well. And so those would be the main ways where you can reach and find me.
Nice. And your book? Where can people find your book?
Their book is on there. It's on Amazon, on Kindle, and hardback. But you can also find it on my website. On my website, I have a lot of media appearances that that's on there, and articles that I've written. So it's a great way to start. You could see a little bit of the summary of my book on there as well, and there's a direct link to Amazon as well.
You're gonna get it. Is it on Audible?
Not yet. That's one thing. A workbook's been thrown out to me and an Audible.
Yeah.
So that might be in the works at some point.
Nice. Well, Dr. Licuanan reminded us today that emotional healing isn't just about therapy. It's about reclaiming identity, rewriting patterns, and choosing legacy over silence. Whether you're rebuilding or supporting someone who is, keep choosing legacy over isolation. Until next time, stay grounded and keep connecting. Dr. Licuanan, thank you so much for joining me again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the conversation.